Mr. President, last month, in a completely partisan process, Senate Democrats pushed through their progressive and deceivingly named Inflation Reduction Act. That bill was a disaster full of reckless tax increases and spending, but perhaps the worst part of it was it authorized $80 billion in new funding to the IRS. $80 billion. For reference, that is about the same as what we allocated for Florida's entire state budget when I was governor. And Florida is the third largest state in the nation. Even though the IRS does a poor job with the resources it currently has, Democrats opted to supersize the IRS so they can fund 87,000 new IRS agents, some of whom will be armed and willing to use deadly force to carry out their duties. So while Democrats are calling to defund the police and leaving our Border Patrol agents without the tools they need to secure the southern border, they're happy to enlarge the IRS. We don't even have 20,000 Border Patrol agents, a quarter of the number of new IRS agents Democrats want. Yet they have now approved 87,000 additional IRS agents. That's insane. That many agents under the direction of President Biden should concern every American. We all remember that when Joe Biden was vice president, the IRS went after conservative groups and Tea Party organizations. Now, armed with tens of billions of dollars in new funding and tens of thousands of new agents, what is stopping Joe Biden from directing the IRS to go after groups he doesn't like? What about pregnancy resource centers, or Second Amendment groups? Here's what Democrats are doing. They're turning the IRS into a super agency to audit more Americans so they can fund even more of their reckless tax and spend agenda. And let's not forget that last year, Democrats wanted the IRS to spy on nearly every American bank account and track their everyday transactions. American families can see straight through Biden's plans, and they are furious. We all should be furious. Without a single Republican vote, Democrats authorized 87,000 more IRS agents, doubling the size of the agency, all to pull as many dollars as they can away from hardworking families and small businesses so they can fund liberal projects and appease their radical base with more government bailouts. Case in point, Biden's illegal order to transfer student loan debt from borrowers to taxpayers. Someone has to pay for the hundreds of billions of dollars in debt that these borrowers voluntarily took on. Now, instead of the borrowers paying for their own education, that burden is now borne by every American taxpayer. You didn't go to college? Democrats don't care. You will pay the debt of lawyers and doctors. Have you already paid off your debt loans? Biden doesn't want to hear it. Tough luck. Your taxes are the money pot for other people's student debt. And if Democrats are going to keep declaring everything to be free, Biden is going to need a lot more taxpayer money. That, my fellow Americans, is how we get full circle back to the supersized IRS. It's a vicious cycle to fund a radical socialist agenda. We have to stop it now. I'm here to do what countless Floridians have asked me to do, strike this terrible policy from law. It's time to rein in the federal government, and that work begins with putting a stop to Biden's IRS army. My bill will simply repeal this disastrous IRS expansion. I ask all my colleagues to support it. As if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senate 4798. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection? The senator from Oregon.
President, it's time for a reality check here in the Senate. The far right has had an awful lot to say about the IRS these last few days. Even senators who should supposedly know better are spinning wild fantasy stories about 87,000 agents who are armed to the teeth and coming to the doors of innocent small business people. Mr. President, all this talk is unscathed by the truth. Here's what is true. Every year, wealthy tax cheats and scofflaw corporations skip out on paying what they owe, ripping off the American people for billions and billions of dollars. Let me say that again, Mr. President. Wealthy tax cheats are ripping off innocent taxpayers every year of billions and billions of dollars. They're sophisticated. They're wealthy. They want to protect the status quo. And by attacking the IRS, Republicans are helping high-flying tax cheats get away with breaking the law. The IRS has had its resources gutted by Republicans over the last decade. It's badly outmatched now by the wealthy tax cheats, who have armies of lawyers and accountants who are prying open loopholes and hiding income in the shadows. Let me give the Senate an example. A few weeks ago, I put out the findings of a year-long Finance Committee investigation into the largest alleged tax evasion scheme by one individual in American history. With the right financial wizardry and a complicated network of offshore accounts and partnerships, this individual, Robert Brockman, was able to evade taxes on over $2 billion in income. To hide his money, he set up offshore entities that we called shell banks. They were offshore entities dressed up like financial institutions Mr. Brockman set up to hide his money from the IRS, betting correctly that the IRS wouldn't have the resources to uncover his scheme. Mr. President, there may be hundreds of thousands more of these shell banks that the IRS has never examined. The Finance Committee is also in the midst of an investigation into the tax practices of some of the biggest members of Big Pharma. One of the companies whose tax data we examined was AbbVie. In 2020, 75% of AbbVie's sales were made in the United States, but AbbVie reported only 1% of its income to the U.S. for tax purposes. Earlier this year, we requested financial information from Merck, which makes nearly half of its sales in the United States, but reported only 14% of its income here. We also requested information from Bristol-Myers Squibb, which reportedly used a thicket of foreign subsidiaries and partnerships to take its effective tax rate from 24.7% all the way down to a negative 7% in a single year. The IRS struggles to do anything about many of these cases, even when they get reported in the press. Criminal tax evasion cases have fallen nearly by half. The number of highly trained experts who know how to break down these complex tax evasion cases has fallen by a third. It takes hundreds and hundreds of hours to review the tax filings of corporations and the rich, and the IRS just doesn't have the resources to go after these wealthy tax cheats and scofflaw corporations. So there's a reason why Democrats believe you have to invest more resources in enforcing the laws on the books. And here's the most important point. It doesn't have anything to do with middle-class taxpayers, because their taxes, Mr. President, are taken out automatically of every single paycheck. That's real different than the way the big guys go about their activities, ripping off the little guys with complex tax evasion schemes. What so many Republicans want to do is preserve the status quo so only the little guys get audited, while billionaire friends like Robert Brockman get off scot-free. The funding for the IRS is also, Mr. President, about providing a basic level of customer service to taxpayers in Colorado and Oregon and every part of the country. At one point during the filing season this year, the IRS told the Finance Committee that it was able to answer only 11% of the service phone calls it was receiving. Taxpayers in America deserve better service from their government, and that means making sure the IRS has the resources to provide it. The far right and the tax cheats, the wealthy tax cheats, want the IRS apparently to continue to struggle because it makes it easier to attack and vilify. That's why we've heard so many falsehoods about thousands of new IRS agents. I don't know where this number came from. Absolute nonsense conjured out of nothing. Even worse are the falsehoods, Mr. President, about IRS agents and firearms. Alongside the DEA, FBI, and other law enforcement agencies, the IRS often plays a part in going after drug cartels, money launderers, and other serious hardened criminals. And so the question is, how do my Republican colleagues expect IRS criminal investigation officers to defend themselves during drug busts against violent cartels? Should they bring a set of sharpened number 2 pencils? We're talking about living in the real world. The IRS funding Democrats passed last month is about making sure that the IRS can do its job, meet the expectations of the American people. And I can tell you, Mr. President, as a senator who has town hall meetings in every county of my state every year, the people of my state say, look, we are law-abiding, we pay our taxes, there's something way out of whack when these wealthy tax cheats and scofflaw corporations can pay little or nothing. It's time for members of Congress to stop going to bat for these wealthy tax cheats who break the law. The IRS needs to be able to crack down on these ripoffs. The IRS needs to be able to provide adequate and timely service to taxpayers who need help. That's what the IRS funding does, and what we have heard so much about from my colleagues on the far right, raising this specter of agents, thousands of them armed to the teeth, coming to the doors of small businesses. This is simply unscathed by the truth. And for that reason, I object, Mr. President.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
Senator from Florida.
so my colleague, I agree with my colleague that if you owe your taxes, you should pay your taxes. But what's inconsistent with what my colleague just said is we had an amendment vote that would say that none of these agents could go after anybody making less than $400,000 a year. And every Democrat, I believe, in the Senate voted against that. So the goal was absolutely we should make sure that wealthy taxpayers pay all their everything they owe. But we had an amendment that would make sure this was focused on wealthy taxpayers during the vote just before we left on recess. And every Democrat voted against that. For all those who are watching, here's what you're going to see. The Democrat Party has created a platform to audit more Americans, not just wealthy Americans, all Americans. This isn't about fairness. This is about power. Democrats, have wanted to spy on your bank transactions, and they want to send 87,000 more IRS agents out on the streets to collect the bill for their reckless spending. Joe Biden has pitched this provision in the image of Robin Hood taking from the rich. But in reality, this expansion is the image of the Sheriff of Nottingham stealing from the poor and the working class. None of us should be surprised that Democrats are doubling down on the radical IRS expansion policies, but we all should be pretty mad. And when Republicans take control of Congress in January, you can expect that we'll do everything in our power to repeal this terrible policy. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The Senator from Oregon.
Briefly to discuss the amendment that came up during the budget discussion. Senate Democrats made it very, very clear we were strongly against taxing those in our country with incomes under $400,000. The problem with the amendment that Republicans offered is they used the word taxable income. So while we strongly oppose raising taxes on middle-class people and others under $400,000, the wording of the Republican amendment, which talked about taxable income, could have immunized billionaires from being subject to an audit. That's because, Mr. President, as you and I have talked about, billionaires often live by this buy, borrow, and die philosophy. And they have little or no taxable income for years on end. My colleagues probably saw some of the stories, for example, about billionaires who are claiming the child tax credit because their taxable income was actually low under the way it is defined. So just to make sure the record is clear, we're all in on this effort of not taxing middle-income folks. We subscribe completely. In fact, what we had in the bill in our enforcement section made that clear as well. But we are not for creating new paths to tax evasion for billionaires. And regrettably, that's what the language in the Republican amendment would have done. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Florida.
the easiest way to solve my colleague's issue would have been to propose an amendment to make sure that we didn't go after taxpayers making less than $400,000 a year, but not one Democrat did that. All they did was vote against this, and then after the fact say, well, it was a language issue. If it was simply a language issue, we could have solved it that night. I yield the floor.